So I'm very grateful to have been invited, and I'm very touched that you should come and allow me to share what is a lifetime's passion, an ever deepening and increasing lifetime's passion. So we'll start. You here all right? Yes. I think it's useful to orientate ourselves, to sense the environment in which we exist. We're completely unconscious most of the time of the influences that reach us from beyond our immediate local physical environment. And so it's a good idea to start with the sun, without which our life couldn't last 1 second. The whole of the life of the earth is utterly dependent on this extraordinary being, you could say. I quote data I get off the internet: the sun fuses 600 million metric tons of hydrogen every second. So it just reminds us of the forces and the powers there in the higher world. And this environment isn't limited to the solar system. This is an enhanced photograph, as you can have nowadays, of the galaxy. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, contains 100,000 million stars. That's just our galaxy, just our local galaxy. And as far as is known, there are 2 million galaxies. I mean, they're unthinkable, they're meaningless, these numbers. But from the point of view of the spiritual and the sacred and the wisdom that we search for, we have to remember this is our environment. And many of the objects and ideas which I want to discuss are events created in the life of this knowledge, this search for what can be referred to as what is higher. In fact, I quote, you will know this from the Hermetic tradition, one of the great sayings of Hermes Trismegistus: as above, so below. And this reminds us exactly of what I'm trying to say. Another universal saying from the point of view of the ideas we're going to discuss: know thyself. It's there at the heart of the Greek tradition and the Indian tradition. It's there at the heart of the Christian tradition. One of the writings of Evagrius, writing in the 4th century, begins by saying, if you wish to know God, first know yourself. So we're immediately introduced to ideas, influences, thoughts on a scale unimaginable compared with the local situation where we live and operate. And yet all this is around us and above us and is part of the search for higher knowledge. This is a photograph, not in color, because it was taken at the beginning of the 20th century, of a church no longer existing. It was destroyed in 1922 in the period of the civil wars in Turkey after the end of the Ottoman Empire. But it illustrates, it's a mosaic on a very big scale, coming from the 12th century. And it illustrates some of what we are talking about. The above, the higher, represented by a circle representing the divine world, the cosmos, from which energies or light emanate, below which is the Mother of God, Mary, enthroned, with presenting the world with the Christ, and then below her the ground. She doesn't stand on the ground, she's already one step above the level of the earth. So the golden mosaic background, we don't see it as gold here, represents infinite space. So we're in the world of the above and the below. Incidentally, the Greek inscription tells us, it's a quotation from ancient scripture, Hebrew scripture, thou wast made before time. So again, we're talking about events, ideas, influences from infinite space and outside time. This is a close-up of an icon of Christ. The Greek title of this figure is Christ Pantocrator. Pan, everything, autocrat, the ruler of all. Christ in majesty, it's sometimes called. And it's particularly interesting to look at the lettering in the halo, the Greek letters, representing ho, on, the omicron, the omega, and the nu. Ho, on is the words with which God identifies himself to Moses at the encounter of the burning bush in the Old Testament. It means, I am. Translated in the King James Bible is, I am that I am. Scholars who don't like this religious terminology like to say the being, or the one who is. And one senses that is the meaning expressed in the look, the encounter that we share, that we exchange looking at this face of Christ. The icon itself dates from the end of the 15th or the 16th century, but it's a type that is developed very early in Christianity, almost unchanged from icons you see in St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, dating from the 6th or 7th century. So here we are, I am. It's the mystery of being, of existence, of self-knowledge. And here is a similar icon, same subject. It's a well-known icon of rather monumental proportions. It's in the Byzantine, yes, I think it's in the Athens Museum of Christian Art, the Byzantine Museum in Athens. But if we look at the lettering either side of the head, E Sophia to Theo, the wisdom of God. Wisdom is one of the themes that I want to develop and share with you a little bit, because wisdom is to do with how, as human beings, with our capacities for thought, we search and receive these divine influences from the cosmos. In fact, wisdom, or Sophia, was a theme that ran through all of Christianity in the Middle Ages and the early Christian period and the Byzantine era. This is a Russian icon of wisdom, of Sophia, illustrated as a feminine figure, and with the figure of Christ sort of coming out of the head. Typical Russian painting of the late 16th century. Not naturalistic, as no icon can be, because what is being illustrated are ideas that are beyond where the ordinary rational mind would ever go. So I've made a kind of diagram here that might help us to negotiate what we're going to try and talk about. The above, the higher, I'm calling divine wisdom, or Sophia, and you will see that this was the name given to many of the greatest cathedrals in the Byzantine world from the very earliest times. And as we saw in the mosaic from the Church of the Dormition, something descends, something comes down. One of the great early saints says, St. Basil the Great, writing in the 9th century or the 10th century, we cannot know God in his essence, but we can know his energies. So this idea of energies as a force, as an emanation, as a radiation coming down from above that we can receive. So there are many words, God, the absolute, nirvana, infinity, the cosmos. We're going to use the word wisdom or Sophia. They're only words in the end, and the real experience for anyone who has a spiritual practice will know that the experience is beyond words. It's a matter of silence. So descending this energy is received by us, by human beings. And the monastic tradition, which is the real center of these activities, is a practice. And if you study the monastic life of Christianity between the 4th and 5th century, when it was established in the Egyptian desert, later in Mount Athos in the 10th, 12th century, and also from very early times, from the 5th, 6th century in Europe, the monastic movement was the real heart of Christianity. Before it was compromised by politics and all the problems which it later fell under. So the practice is the reception of the energy, the operation of the energy, and the practitioner is actually the receiver and the container of the energy. So an artist in the sacred traditions, and this is universal for all the sacred traditions, we will see some influences later, is able to manifest that energy having received it. The forms, the images, the colors, the mathematics of sacred art are manifestations of this descending energy of wisdom. And this energy is a transformation both of the materials that the artist is working with, and if he is a spiritual practitioner, it transforms the practitioner. And here we come to the idea of tradition, which all of you here will be very familiar with, all the great ancient sacred traditions, where what was established for the forms comes from the theology, so that there's nothing of the how shall I say, the ego. The artist is, the practitioner puts the ego aside in order to be a vehicle for this descending energy of wisdom that comes from the highest places in the cosmos. In fact, in Constantinople, or Istanbul as we say today, the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, built in the 5th century, is the Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia. And wisdom was the subject, the theme to which all religious and spiritual practice was dedicated. And if we look inside, it's quite an interesting image of how the forms of the architecture, the play of light, is a handling, a manipulation of energies. Light itself, of course, is an energy, and it's a symbol of divine energy. So great ancient sacred buildings, knowing the laws of vibrations, knowing the laws of proportion, I wanted to say that I would like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of Keith. Many of you here knew him and were influenced by him, but Keith Critchlow had changed many people's lives, certainly mine, and he was the spirit behind the study of sacred geometry and sacred mathematics, and many of the ideas that we touch on, certainly the architectural forms of sacred buildings. So we see here in this extraordinary use of space and light. Now, this is an image of a Saint, Gregory Palamas, who is the representative of something called the Hesychast revival in the 14th century. Hesychasm is a Greek word, it comes from the Greek word ezekia, meaning silence or stillness. And that was at the heart of all spiritual practice, in all traditions, of course, and certainly the beginnings of the monastic movement, as I said, in Egypt. By the 5th century, there were 50,000 monks in monasteries in the Egyptian desert. And if one had visited such a place, you would have got an impression more like what you might find today if you went to Japan to visit a Zen Buddhist monastery. Extraordinarily powerful and demanding discipline, physical disciplines, mental disciplines, spiritual disciplines, followed with an extraordinary demand that brings about, after a lifetime of meditation or contemplation or prayer, this actual quality of transformation. And in the 14th century, there was a revival in the Byzantine world, in Constantinople, led by this St. Gregory Palamas. And I like looking at his face because he is so human. There's something so touching, so tender, so vulnerable. He is like us. He is human, and yet he is transformed by his inner work, his spiritual work. And I have not much doubt that to paint such a vivid image, the painter, the practitioner, similarly was animated by energies that don't come just from the physical world, but from the spiritual world, and can be received through the practice. This is a cathedral in Novgorod in Russia of the 12th century. I show it simply because it is dedicated to Sophia, the wisdom. So we are reminded all the time that this higher energy, this higher influence from very, very high, unimaginably high, is memorialized by the dedication of these churches. And not only in the Slavic world or the Byzantine world. My personal, I'm allowed to say this because it's my personal journey, but my favorite building in England is Lincoln Cathedral. And these places have the effect of lifting the spirit. You cannot encounter them, even in an image, without a sense of awe and wonder at this marvelous harmony of form, this sense, even if we don't measure it or analyze it, of mathematical precision and balance. And the mathematics of sacred buildings, when the tradition is authentic, are representations of cosmic mathematics. Pythagoras tells us that the stars are numbers. And Keith must have told you about this wonderful image of the progress of Venus through its 14 cycles, making, I haven't got an image of it here, that's for another lecture, but events in the cosmos, the movements of the stars, are mathematically ordered, and knowledge of those mathematics is the part of the forms, the traditions, as well as the practice. This is the interior of Lincoln Cathedral, and again, something quite extraordinary about the play of light and the form. It's very unusual to see a European cathedral without the chairs, so I particularly like this photograph because it allows us to kind of float in the space and even in the photograph assimilate the energy symbolized as light and is light, all of which is received through the faculties, through the senses, and has a transforming effect on the psyche, on the soul. It's part of the mystery of art, of course, that it can speak to us, to our humanity, through channels which, in the ordinary sense, we're not aware of, but which can be open and where energies can be received. This is not a little bit cluttered, but it's an extraordinary building, the north transept of the Cathedral of Soissons in northern France. I don't know whether for you this conveys this, again, the sense of order and light, the forms of the architecture, the material of the architecture with its vibration and the effects of acoustics and vibration which has its resonance within the psyche. And of course, while we're in the West, we can't not look at how light is transformed through coloured glass. This is the famous rose window in Chartres. Light is a theme that all the great philosophers have used as a symbol of divine energy. Part of my work was to study the philosopher Plotinus, the Neoplatonist of the 2nd, 3rd century, who formulated the Platonic vision of the universe, but in a very ecstatic way. And he is the primary influence on the Christian mystical tradition. He wasn't Christian himself, but there's a point in the development of Christian culture in the late Roman period, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, when it was the perennial philosophy. The thinkers, the philosophers, the religious mystics, the prophets could have access to ideas about what we would call theology now, or art. And Plotinus has this formula: light penetrates matter and endows form. This idea was later formulated by the physicists of the 19th century, and according to modern science, this is how objects take on their character. A table will receive certain vibrations of light and reflect others, and the eye takes in certain vibrations, the ones that have been reflected and not the ones that have been absorbed, and gives us form. So what physics discovered in the modern scientific sense was already known by philosophy 2,000 years before, or maybe more than 2,000 years before. So certainly when light passes through coloured glass, a transformation of energy is taking place, which accounts for the extraordinary impression if you go into certain cathedrals that still have their original 13th century glass. It has this quality of an overwhelming impression of lifting the spirit. It's an emotional and a psychical and a spiritual experience. I feel a certain diffidence at explaining it. It's ridiculous in a way to explain it, because at that moment when we are open to these impressions, we are transformed, or the beginning of a transformation is taking place, And it's taking place not by some accident, but through the immense traditions of knowledge, of vibrations, of acoustics, of the laws of light, the laws of color, which were studied in the traditions of ancient art and assimilated in Byzantium in the Middle Ages, if you're looking at the European tradition. Well, this is an icon by the famous Andrei Rublev, painted about 1410. It's in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. Maybe some of you have seen it, part of a group called the Zvenigorod Disis. But Rublev is very, very famous, the most famous icon painter in Russia. And part of the amazing thing about his art is his use of color, transparency of color. And if we look at a detail of, this is actually not the same icon, but the companion icon, we could be looking at an abstract painting. But what has happened to the light as it passes through the pigment? This is the egg tempera technique, and under the hand of a genius like Andrei Rublev, he creates these transparent tonalities. So the light, the sun, passes through the layers of color onto the ground, which in many icons is gold, or sometimes it's the ivory white, the polished ivory white, after which it bounces back, it reflects back through the color and into us, into the eyes, and then through the faculty of seeing into the soul, into the psyche. So what we are looking at in this detail is a transformation of the materials, that's to say the pigments, through the influence of an energy which is light, which itself is an energy, and it's also a symbol of divine energy, of the highest imaginable energies. If one is in an open state, one sees these extraordinarily beautiful works of art, and one feels one's spirit is lifted. This is a 16th century icon in the folk museum of Bergen in Norway, of all places, donated in 1920 by a Norwegian collector who had lived in Russia. And again, it represents St. Basil. It's a 16th century icon, but when we look at it as one might look at say an abstract painting, one is filled with wonder at what has happened to the material under the hand of the painter. He's used these wonderful the crosses in a mathematical form, but the way the color is used, the transparency of the color, of course all that is reflected in the actual expression on the face of the saint. It's never, as in medieval icons, the naturalistic look of post-Renaissance art. It is the look of someone whose attention, whose look is inner rather than outer. His focus of attention is within himself, which is how he opens, how the transformation within to the divine energies which he expresses. So, if you are at all familiar with the Byzantine Orthodox tradition, the liturgical year is punctuated by 12 great feasts, and one of the greatest of them is Transfiguration or Metamorphosis. It is an illustration of the moment described in the Christian Gospel when the three apostles, Peter, James, and John, were suddenly saw Christ transfigured by light, and two Old Testament prophets either side of him. So again, this is a picture of an illustration in form of an event that is not a historical event, but an event that takes place in the life of certainly a monk following the Hesychast prayer tradition. The tradition demands that you meditate or pray with each breath and all the time, unceasingly. In fact, in the writings of St. Paul the Apostle, he enjoins his followers, pray without ceasing. And they put this literally into practice with a mantra, in fact, the famous so-called Jesus prayer. So if you devote your psychic life, your mental life, to such a practice, eventually a certain transformation takes place, something that could not happen according to the laws of the purely material world. So, a change of scenery. The Taj Mahal, probably the most famous, one of the most famous buildings in the world. What I'm interested to discuss here, and many of you will have had this experience, will have been there and seen this building, is what the polished, very finely polished limestone, white limestone, does to the light. This is really a transformation. The stone reflects light, absorbs light, refracts light, giving an extraordinary, particularly in the kind of light that you have in India, and it has an hypnotic effect when you are witnessing it. And even in a sense, one can get an echo of it in a photograph like this. So I think the builders, this was not chance, this was knowledge. And I'm always interested to remind ourselves that the pyramids in Egypt were once clad in finely polished limestone, like the Taj Mahal. And they would have, in the Egyptian desert, in that extraordinary light, had this same transforming light effect. Much of the casing stone now forms the mosques of the Mamluk period in Cairo, those beautiful mosques, you will have seen them. But once the pyramids had the same transformed light as the Taj Mahal has. So some of you may know this building. This is the Karatai Mosque, the famous Seljuk mosque of the 12th century in Konya, where an entire ceiling, it's not a mosque, it's a madrasa, and you've got to imagine a room maybe 5 or 6 or 7 times as large as the room we're in, with a domed ceiling, with tile work, with this fabulous geometry, and the sense of the cosmic spiral. So again, whether you visit as a pilgrim or as a tourist, or you can't not have a transforming experience when you are surrounded by these circumstances. And the effect is physical and emotional and spiritual, I would say. And what is so interesting is, because as you will know very well here in the Prince's School, the Islamic tradition, the medieval Islamic tradition, received the great knowledge of the Neoplatonist schools. They had the Platonic Academy in Athens survived until the 5th century AD. It was the Emperor Justinian who closed it down. It wasn't quite the great place it had been in the 5th century before Christ in Athens, but it still existed. And the Emperor Justinian closed it down, and the remaining philosophers loaded up their books and their instruments, rulers and compasses perhaps, onto their camels and donkeys and made their way to Baghdad. And that was how the great Greek knowledge came to the Islamic world and the origin of the great school of Baghdad. And that very high period of the 12th, 13th century in the Islamic world, both particularly in the art, but also in the literature and the poetry. It was the period when the brotherhoods, the Sufi brotherhoods were formed. And I think this is a direct expression of this tradition of transforming knowledge passed down from generation to generation in schools of the highest kind of knowledge. People use the term esoteric schools, if you like, Gnostic knowledge, spiritual knowledge, of a very high order, unimaginably high order. And I can't help relating it to the Sema, which probably took place in the Karatai mosque. And here is this question of practice and practitioner. This famous dance, many of you will have seen it, I suppose, which is a form of prayer, zikr, it's the remembrance of God, with a mantra, in fact, is again a transforming experience. And because it's a physical act in this case, we are brought very close to the idea of energy at the human level, but received from a divine level. I've been told, and one sees it in the figure on the right, that the one hand receives the energy from above and the other hand passes it down to the earth. Yes, this shows it very well. So this is a practice, and a practice that makes demands on the body and the mind, and the combination of the discipline is a transforming event in the psyche. And it's not unique to the Sufi orders. I find this picture fascinating because the two dancers express identically the same energy, but identical. It's a very great discipline, this kind of dancing, as we know, and something, when one sees it very clearly, a transformation has taken place. Two, as you might say, normal human beings, the vehicles for something that is not normal, something that is divine, as an actual discipline, as an actual practice. This is the Himalayas. This is the sacred dancing this was actually taken in Bhutan, in one of the relocated Tibetan monasteries. And again, the same idea exactly. Everything, the colors, the costume, the forms of the dance, the demands on the body, move the practitioner away from the purely mundane world into a world where something else is experienced. Now this is the holy mountain, Mount Athos, and it's a place where this practice is followed, maybe even today. And since the 9th or 10th century, this is the Simona Petra monastery. And one sees by its location, the beauty of its location, how, and the elevation, that these are external references to what is ultimately an internal experience of being isolated from the lower influences, the gross vulgarities of the world, in order to be near a God, as you might say. And here's a picture which I find deeply affecting. The body expressing the reception of divine energy in prayer. There is something so simple and unpretentious and pure in this figure of a man, a human being, dedicating his inner energies, his thought, his body, to the practice of contemplative prayer. And this is taken in recent times. This is a photograph of the icon painting studio in the Vatopedi monastery in Mount Athos. And they work there for 2 hours at a time in absolute silence, 7 or 8 young monks painting an icon, and one of them repeats with each breath, Kyrie Jesu Christi eleemon me, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. Kyrie Jesu Christi eleemon me, with each breath. And after a certain amount of time, in this absolute silence and the repetition of the prayer, creates an atmosphere of very great concentration and force. And that atmosphere, that energy, is part of the life of the painter, and proceeds from his inner life through the arm into the hand onto the panel that he's painting. So the work of art actually receives through the gesture. It's like the dancing. It's a form of dancing to paint. And if that gesture and if that energy is according to the tradition, the laid down guides of the tradition, where the discipline is very demanding and very precise, something can appear. If you're interested, the icon that he is doing a version of is this icon. We've seen 2 other versions of it already, the Christ Pantocrator. And one can't doubt the encounter of this look is powerful. It demands something of us as we exchange our gaze with his gaze. This is the full one that we saw at the beginning. This is in a collection in Belgium now. It was in the Temple Gallery at one time. Ah, yes. I wish I could tell you that this is Meister Eckhart. We don't know what Meister Eckhart looks like, but this is a Renaissance painting by Giovanni Bellini of the founder of the Dominican order, of which Eckhart was one of the most famous practitioners. And Eckhart is very interesting. The 12th, 13th century is an extraordinary period. It's the period of Andrei Rublev. It's the period of the foundation of the brotherhoods in the Sufi orders, Mevlana. It's the period that corresponds to the revival of the Hesychast practiced in Byzantium, in the Byzantine monasteries, and the extraordinary art that they produced. And in the West, you have Meister Eckhart. So we're going to talk for a minute about the Western echo of what we have been talking about, which is the Middle East, Byzantium or Russia or Islam. This is an engraving by a German, a Rhenish master, Martin Schongauer. And it's a picture of the temptation of St. Anthony. St. Anthony is one of the great saints of the early Christian period. He is, well, there are several who claim to be the founders of monastic Christianity. Anthony is one of them. And if you visit the Coptic monasteries in Egypt, the St. Anthony Monastery is one of the most extraordinary places, still thriving and still with practitioners. And if you walk 10 or 5, I can't remember exactly, beyond the monastery, up in the mountain, you can sit in the cave where St. Anthony himself sat for about 60 years of his life, perfecting himself by continuous interior prayer before he came down and became the abbot of the monastery, founded the monastery. So all this was pretty common stuff in the Middle Ages in Europe, incomprehensible to us now, but the figure of St. Anthony is universal, and this is the Western, and in fact it's, if we go a little closer, what interests me is that St. Anthony is there completely calm, completely at peace. He's unbothered by the demons that attack him. And this is a visualization of the inner life of the contemplative prayer or the meditator. Anyone who's experimented with meditation will know that the first obstacle to inner stillness and inner silence is the cascade of thoughts and associations and daydreams that occupy one, and one can't escape from them in a way. So the first stage is to develop a peaceful indifference to the chaos of our psychic, of the inner, our psychic selves. Incidentally, it's very interesting, this is the 17-year-old Michelangelo painting the same, making a painting based on the Martin Schongauer image. Extraordinary image. He's placed it very high. So to have this experience is already a very, very, very high level of spirituality. But I think in the end, Michelangelo is more interested in being a painter than being a spiritual practitioner, but I'm not an expert on Michelangelo, but he was certainly very, very interested in certain aspects of his religion. But Martin Schongauer is part of that Rhenish mystical tradition that of which people like Meister Eckhart was the strongest exponents. But here are these experiences and these events relayed to us in imagery, but expressing a very, very specific set of ideas. Well, I suppose one of the ultimate expressions of practice and transformation, inner transformation, is expressed in a series of life-size figures of Buddhist, they're called in China the Lohans, in Sanskrit they're called arhats. They are sort of the equivalent of the 12 apostles. The Lohans were part of the entourage around the Buddha. I think there were 16, and then later they became 18. And this is it dates from the, well, there's a lot of debate about a lot of disagreement among scholars, but probably the Yuan dynasty, or maybe earlier, 11th or 12th century. And there's one in the British Museum in what used to be called the King Edward VII Gallery. It's now called the Robert Ho Tung Gallery, I believe. And I think in London it is maybe the ultimate accessible visual expression of what we are talking about. Some of you will know this image, of course, and the powerful effect it has if you stand in front of it. But this interests me. This is a photograph taken in Japan, I think in the 1930s, of one of the great roshis. And it's the same as the statue. That is a very, to me, encouraging, heartening image of what is possible. How to pass from the madness of the world we live in, because that madness is in us, that's our psychic state, without the influence of this discipline. So I don't know if you agree with me, but the fact that it's still accessible today as practice, I find remarkable and encouraging when one thinks of, what we get, the story of the world we get in our everyday media. The figure on the left here is another Lohan, a carved wood figure of the same period, probably 13th or 14th century. It's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And the photograph on the right is of another Japanese Zen Roshi. And I don't know if you agree with me, it's wonderful that this is still a living, an actual tradition, not something from the dim and distant past. This is a photograph of a Brahmin in India on the banks of the Ganges. I think it's Varanasi. And if you look at the angles of the body, the absolutely straight back, the firmness and the strength, the solidity of the posture is an expression of the inner being of this Brahmin. I can think of no better expression of how to meditate, if you like, than this picture. In fact, I put it next to a photograph of a bronze Buddha. I think the living figure is almost more powerful than the 12th century statue. And in the Prince's School of Traditional Art, I can't not show a geometric analysis of the Buddha imagery. And you'll be happy to see a pentagon in the center of these arrangements. I don't know if I ever showed this image to Keith, but it reminds us that art of this tradition, of these traditions, could not be further away from the the ideas now that art is considered to be, even at its most serious. I'm not saying that artists don't find something to express, which they do, even because it's a gift to be an artist. Something passes through. Artists see things which, on behalf of us, or more ordinary people who can't see so clearly, and are passing on certain realities, certain truths of, I would say, a very high order. But tradition, when an artist comes under the discipline of tradition, then something else. And yes, I've been exactly 59 minutes. This is my last image. You probably know this. In Japan, certain works of art are regarded as national treasures, and this is one of the most famous of the national treasures of Japan. It's Sengai is what the Zen Buddhist philosopher described as the three fundamental forms as geometries of formlessness and infinity. And again, the gesture, a Zen monk will meditate in front of a tree in a landscape for a week and then put his brush into the ink and sketch it in as long as it takes to breathe in and out once. And the distillation of the energies of his meditation are transferred through the gesture onto the paper. So this is the basis of calligraphy, I think. And this marvelous image, it's also been called the creation of the universe. The three fundamental geometric forms, not done with a ruler and a compass, but an expression of living energy in a being assimilating transformed energies. So, thank you for sharing this journey with me. I hope you found it interesting. We'll stop there. Thank you.